Welcome to Too Complicated for History. I am Isaac S. Loftus, and I'm joined by my co-host, Dr. Lynn Price Robbins.
Hey there.
And twice a month, we bring you the history that has fallen through the cracks of your curriculum and the people who researched it and the sources that they used to gain this knowledge. And today, we're talking about a rather interesting person. We've talked about a lot of historical figures on this show, but I don't think I've ever read a summary of someone's life and name and felt in my bones that this was a made-up person more than today. Today we're talking about a guy named James Oglethorpe, who, amongst many other things, fought in a war called the War of Jenkins' Ear, which sounds like something that was made up by George R. R. Martin or J.R.R. Tolkien or someone else with two middle initials. But it turns out he's a real person, and I'll leave it to Lynn to introduce our guest, who's going to help us in discovering this fascinating man.
Thanks, Isaac. So we're really excited today to have Michael L. Thurmond as our guest. He is the Chief Executive Officer of DeKalb County, Georgia, and also the author of James Oglethorpe, Father of Georgia, A Founder's Journey from Slave Trader to Abolitionist. Thank you so much for being here with us today.
Thank you, Lynn. Isaac, I'm honored to share the microphones with you all today.
Well, thank you. I'm excited to talk about James Oglethorpe and for all of our listeners to learn all about him. So I think probably the best thing to start with is besides fighting in something called the War for Jenkins' Ear, who in the world was this fella, and how did you get interested in writing so much about him?
James Oglethorpe is the principal founder of the colony of Georgia. He and 20 other trustees received a charter from King George in 1733. He founded the settlement of Savannah and ultimately the colony of Georgia. Georgia is the last of the so-called 13 British colonies in North America. Georgia is also unique because Georgia was the only one of the 13 colonies that prohibited chattel slavery prior to the American Revolutionary War. Not New York, not Pennsylvania, not Massachusetts, not New Jersey, but Georgia.
I am a little dumbfounded in the fact that I'd never heard that before in my life. I'm from one of the colonies. I'm from Pennsylvania, and that is is James Oglethorpe something that people who are from Georgia, students that from Georgia, learn about like in their education?
It's a standard part of a social studies middle school curriculum, but this James Oglethorpe is not taught. The
Okay.
James Oglethorpe, who was anti-slavery, who became an abolitionist, is a James Oglethorpe that was a surprise to me and for many other people who read this book. He's an unknown quantity because of his very visionary views and deeds and words as it relates to chattel slavery.
So when you were in school in Georgia, what did they teach you about him? And then sort of how did that vision or perception of him get changed on his head when you started researching this book? Because I'm really interested about these two Oglethorpes that we have.
The James Oglethorpe that's taught in our public schools was a member of the British Parliament during the early decades of the 18th century. He sought to alleviate the plight of British debtors. Tens of thousands of British citizens have been thrown into prison because they were poor, unemployed, could not pay their debts. So Oglethorpe sought to create a colony between British controlled South Carolina and Spanish controlled Florida, whereby impoverished and persecuted British citizens could find a new life and a second opportunity to support themselves and their families in the new world.
So he was known as the for the downtrodden, but it was just the British white downtrodden. They don't
Absolutely.
talk at all about his view on slavery or anything when you learn about him.
Well, he and the trustees believed that that chattel slavery would impede the efforts of poor British citizens who were trying to learn new skills and
Right.
new ethics and new characteristics to learn how to work and support themselves.
Mm.
But the narrative is that prohibition of slavery had everything to do with white British colonists, but nothing to do with the plight or any concern about enslaved blacks.
Hmm.
The idea was the prohibition was to protect white colonists, but there was no concern, no empathy, sympathy for enslaved black people. And my research undermines that narrative and tells a totally different story about Oglethorpe, his fellow trustees, and the early founding of Georgia's colony.
This episode of Too Complicated for History is brought to you by our supporters over on Patreon. If you'd like to support the show and join the conversation, our membership is completely free. And that gives you access to our Discord, which is a place for like-minded history fans and even some of the historians that we've interviewed to just chat, hang out, and ask interesting questions. Our paid tiers give you access to exclusive content, live streams, and even signed book giveaways. Check it out today at patreon.com/primary source media. That's patreon.com/primary source media. Pat should put it in a graphic right about here. Now let's get back to the show. I think you're touching on something that is a hard reality for people to wrap their minds around, in that oftentimes when we're talking about chattel slavery, especially during the founding era and the founding fathers and other people who Americans admire the work that they did, trying to square that with slavery and saying that they didn't know any better, that it was of the time, and that was sort of, and that could not be farther from the truth. People knew that there were moral implications to what was going on. It's not that it was a completely thought devoid, that was devoid from their head until abolitionism became more of a mainstream thought process later in the 19th century. But like you're saying, it dates back even farther than than America's founding. I mean, you're talking about people who were thinking about this in the 1730s, 1740s. That's pretty early.
Yeah, Isaac, you are so on point with that. There was an British American colonists and later Americans made a conscious choice to
Right.
pursue the enslavement of Africans. It was a binary situation. There were those white colonists who opposed it from inception. And one of the things I think that's critical, you're from Pennsylvania. I think you said Pennsylvania, right?
Yeah.
So typically the narrative is the first anti-slavery activists or abolitionists originated among the Quakers in Pennsylvania. They were early opponents of slavery, but Pennsylvania did not prohibit slavery until much later in the 18th century. Georgia, in the early parts of the 18th century, prohibited slavery. And Oglethorpe, there was no such thing as political correctness in the 1730s, so people spoke very honestly about their views. And one of the main reasons Oglethorpe and his colleagues opposed slavery, because he felt that anyone who extracted wealth from people who worked without compensation was lazy. He felt that slavery would create an idle, uh, elitist class of people who did not engage in honest labor and appropriated wealth illegally and immorally. So think about that. And he, on multiple occasions, lambasted and criticized what he called idle men who did not want to engage in honest labor, and that they were the ones who were advocating for the legalization of slavery in Georgia.
Yeah, not to take a shot at Virginia, but he must have took one look at Tidewater culture and was like, all right, this is it. A lot of very rich people not engaging in
South Carolina, even more so than Virginia, because South Carolina was the slave trading capital of British colonial America. Look, I want to say this. I think James Oglethorpe, in many ways, was the most consequential founding father of British colonial America. And we know little or nothing about his advocacy. He was not an abolitionist, but he was anti-slavery. One of the things I point out is that we often use or interchange the word anti-slavery and abolitionist almost without any thought, as if they were actually the same philosophical and moral position. They're not. Anti-slavery advocacy predated and was a prerequisite of what became the abolitionist movement. When Oglethorpe founded Georgia, he was anti-slavery. Think about what Georgia was: prohibiting the spread of slavery or a slave-free jurisdiction. Fast forward a century and think about the expansion of the West,
Mm-hmm.
and that policy was the policy that really defined the westward expansion of the United States of America, where you had slave-free states and or territories and states where it was legal.
Right.
Oglethorpe heralded that era by creating a slave-free jurisdiction here in North America.
So before we get too deep into Oglethorpe, I'd love it for you to tell your story about how you became interested in writing about Oglethorpe. And the reason I think it's so perfect for our show is that we always talk about, no matter where you live, you're an hour or two from a historic site. And we're always encouraging people to visit historic sites. And it was actually on a plaque at a historic site that you sort of got the idea that there was something about Oglethorpe that maybe you didn't learn in school and sort of started off this whole process. So can you tell us a bit about that?
Oh, thank you, Lynn. I was a member of a 57-person delegation of distinguished Georgian academics, politicians who traveled to England to celebrate the 300th anniversary of the birth of James Edward Oglethorpe. It was October of 1996. On the last day of our 4-day pilgrimage, we visited Cranham, his historical home of his family, and we visited the Church of All Saints there in the village of Cranham, which is located 19 miles northeast of London. Oglethorpe and his wife Elizabeth are buried beneath the floor of the sanctuary. They're entombed beneath the floor. And not far from his tomb is a white marble plaque. Uh, the plaque lists many platitudes and successes and accomplishments of his life: Oxford, founding of Georgia's Parliament, advocating for debtor prisoners, a war hero. One narrative, one sentence, 8 words carved in marble: he was the friend of the oppressed Negro. I was stunned. At that point, I had already published one book, was working on a second book, obviously educated in the public schools of Georgia, college graduate, lawyer, elected official, but not at any point in my life or my education had I ever heard the father of Georgia being described as a friend of the oppressed Negro. This marble plaque had been commissioned by his wife prior to her death, and it stood there for nearly 200 years.
Wow. And it took you visiting and seeing that to say, there's more here. I need to dig into this story.
Yes. At first, I considered it a lie. I rejected it. No way that could be true.
That's fair.
It was just the unhinged words of a mourning widow who was saying things not based in fact, because there was no evidence that I had been able to read or discern or research that would have led me to believe that that affirmation had any bit of truth associated with it. Not the father of Georgia, of all places, could possibly have been a friend of enslaved Black people.
So you rejected that idea at first. What kept you thinking about it? Because you obviously dug back into the history to confirm it. So how did that process work?
Well, I felt I needed to know personally. I'm not going to say I started out to write a nonfiction book, a biography of James. Right. That was not true. It was personal to me. I was the only African American member of the 57-person delegation, which speaks to why we should have diverse leadership, right? Because maybe everyone read the plaque, maybe no one did, but that sentence resonated with me. Obviously, I felt that and I still believe that I still might be the only Black Georgian ever to visit Oglethorpe's grave. And it was as if that message had been left there just for me. And even though I was unconvinced and dismissive of it, I still wanted to seek to determine whether or not it was true. And honestly, being honest with you, I just knew for a fact that it wasn't, but I wanted to resolve this mystery in my own life, not to write a book, but just on my own personal edification. As a Georgian, as a Black Georgian, I wanted to determine as to whether or not this statement, this claim, had any basis in fact. Now, I knew that slavery had been prohibited, but remember now, it was only to protect white people.
Right.
Right.
This contradicted everything I had been taught, because now you're saying that no, this man was a friend of enslaved Black people. So friend denotes and suggests concern or empathy or even love for someone, and particularly for Black people at this point.
Right. So I'm interested in how you went about finding this truth out. I'm a big nerd for primary sources, and I'm trying to think about what sources you would go to or how you would go about learning more about him, especially when it's not going to be in any of your school books, textbooks, maybe not even in any monographs that have been written. So how did you go about researching this?
Isaac said it seems like a fictional character. This
Yeah.
whole story
Yeah.
seems like something that you would make up. This can't be true. So
Yeah.
what triggers Oglethorpe and ultimately triggered my journey as well was that prior to coming to Georgia, Oglethorpe was the deputy governor of the Royal African Company, which was one of the principal slave trading British firms in the early part of the 18th century. He was deputy governor of the Royal African Company.
What?
And a letter falls in his possession, and the letter is written in Arabic. My book opens not with Oglethorpe, but with a young African named Ayuba Suleiman Diallo, who is captured near the mouth of the Gambia River in February of 1730, transported to the colony of Maryland, enslaved on a tobacco plantation.
Oh, wow.
Following a failed escape attempt, he convinces his enslaver to allow him to write a letter to his father back in what is now present-day Senegal on the west coast of Africa. Diallo writes this letter. The letter travels 4,000 miles through the hands of 5 or 6 white men involved in the slave trade and falls, as I stated, in the possession of Oglethorpe. Obviously, Oglethorpe could not read or interpret the letter because it's in Arabic. He sends it to Oxford University, has it translated. Oglethorpe is so affected by the contents of the letter, he contacts the enslaver in Maryland and arranges for Diallo to be shipped to England and promises to purchase this young man from the enslaver upon his arrival.
Oh, wow.
Oglethorpe is so impacted by the contents of the letter, he resigns his position with the Royal African Company. He sells his stock and sails to America to found a slave-free Georgia colony. It was a letter written by a young African enslaved in Maryland.
So what did you're killing us here? What did the letter say?
I knew that question. That's always the question. Like, what
It's
the
like,
heck
come
is
on,
in
you
the
can't just
letter?
leave us hanging.
Well, first, let's just think about it. No UPS, no FedEx, right? This letter travels 4,000 miles, right?
That
Yeah.
alone is baffling.
And
I'm
no U.S.
constantly telling
Postal
Lynn how
Service. We
it's
still might
crazy.
be waiting for it. But no, I'm just kidding.
Yeah, we're still waiting for it.
Yeah, still waiting for it. So what's interesting is Oglethorpe was also a student of ancient civilizations, Greek, Roman, and African civilizations.
Oh.
He studied it. He began to study while he was in Oxford. So
Oh.
what Oglethorpe saw in the letter, and by the way, this contradicts what was known about the letter, because there's some reference where it says that Oglethorpe was moved by compassion and freed this young man, but it stops. my research unveils that what really impressed Oglethorpe were three things. Number one, he this enslaved black man wrote the letter. You ever
Right.
think at that point in the history of the world, black people were subhuman beasts of burden, that they
Right.
have no traits of civilization. That was the prevailing view of black people. We were property. We were subhuman. So the fact that he was literate
Mm-hmm.
is a trait of civilization.
Right.
In the letter, he talks about his ancestors, his love for his wives and his children, and he promises to them that he will return home one day. Love of
Hmm.
family. Family trait of what? Civilized behavior. Finally, and most important, I believe, he praised Allah and he remained faithful to his religion.
Mm-hmm.
Monotheism, also trait of civilized behavior. So what Oglethorpe saw was not a subhuman beast, but a human being expressing love for family, expressing love for uh, Allah, monotheistic, and someone who is literate and intelligent.
Hmm.
You cannot be both. And
Right.
Oglethorpe saw the humanity in this young man, and that is what triggered his journey from deputy governor of a slave trading firm to becoming one of the first white men in North America to speak out against chattel slavery and helping to breathe life into the former abolitionist movement 50 years later in 1787 in England.
Hmm.
And see, the thing I talk a lot about is Oglethorpe, not the anti-slavery advocate or even that. What's most significant, I believe, is the journey. You follow this man's journey from
Right.
awareness to advocacy to seeing the humanity of blacks and then becoming really radicalized to
Hmm.
seek the abolition of slavery in England.
So did he? I know you mentioned that he was married. Did he have a family, as like a larger family as well? Did he have children? Like, what it was that some connection, and empathy that he was seeing
Oh.
in that letter as well? I'm just curious about his religiosity and and his connection to family potentially, because those are the other things that we're touching on.
At the
Right.
time of the founding of Georgia, he was a bachelor. He later
Hmm.
married uh, his wife, Elizabeth, who was a wealthy
Okay.
heiress. They did not have children, but he was a bachelor when he came to Georgia. And as he witnessed and was really appalled by the brutality and the horror of slavery, particularly in South Carolina, his
Hmm.
attitude against slavery began to harden, and he became more and more aggressive in his outspoken behavior against slavery. Uh, his first recorded statement in opposition to slavery was in February 1739, where that was a pro-slavery, as you might expect, contingent in Georgia, who wanted to legalize slavery in Georgia, who
Mm-hmm.
tried everything they possibly could, including a smear campaign that ultimately resulted in him being forced out of Georgia. But he first spoke out against slavery that we can document when he's against, well, not against slavery, but he first spoke out about the consequences of slavery as it related to black people in
Mm-hmm.
1739 when he said that the legalization in slavery would occasion the misery of thousands of people in Africa who now live there free. What this does, I think it not only several reviewers have suggested that this actually adds a new chapter to Georgia history. It
Mm-hmm.
also adds a new chapter to the history of the United States of America. It's back to what Isaac said,
Right.
that there were people who we don't know a lot about who stood up and fought against this institution.
Right.
Many of them have been marginalized or hidden from view from in terms of history, or their narrative has been narrowed so that it can be excluded. So what we see and what I believe is that it forces to the front the reality that these were conscious decisions, that
Right.
there were people who recognized that black people were not beasts of burden. Now you asked about his religiosity. He was a part of a group of white evangelicals. Some of the first anti-slavery and ultimately evangelists were white evangelicals.
Hmm.
Yes, who and even they weren't abolitionists, but they did possess or believe one thing that became critical. They believed that enslaved black people possess redeemable souls.
Hmm.
The prevailing view among Christians was that if you are a beast, then you could not possess a redeemable soul.
Mm.
So you couldn't be Christianized.
Right.
To the contrary, they believe that, well, you are enslaved, but you're still a human being that's enslaved. And
Right.
even more radical for that era, they believe that black and white Christianized people, their souls would have equal access to the kingdom of heaven.
Hmm.
That
Wow,
did not
that's
sit
radical.
well with white Christians.
Right.
Because think about it, the equality of the soul was a preface to equality of your corporal self.
Right.
And so I argue, and one of my favorite writers is Malcolm Gladwell, right? And he points out these small things that have major results if you really look at it.
Sure.
This advocacy to create a Christianized enslaved population, and even more critical, during the early part of the 18th century, you couldn't just join the church.
Mm-hmm.
Like my church, you can party all Saturday night, but if you just stop by the church on Sunday, you can join, right? You good.
Right. Right. Right.
I mean, which is fair. But
Yeah.
during the early part of the 18th century, Christianization was a process.
Mm-hmm.
You had to
Mm.
learn the catechisms, you had to learn certain tenets. But in order to learn the catechism, what did you have to know how to do? Read and write.
Read. Yeah.
Right.
So these missionaries first had to teach enslaved blacks how to read and write,
Mm-hmm.
which created a whole nother group of folk who opposed it.
Right.
Because there's one gentleman who states that, look, if you teach a black man how to read one book, even if it's the Bible, he'll read another book.
Yep.
And consequently, he will be less inclined to accept his enslavement. So, inadvertently or even by intent, the Christianization of the early 18th century blacks gave them access to literacy and the
Mm-hmm.
Mm.
ability to read and write, and that would have major, major consequences for blacks who would later fight to destroy American and British slavery.
I think that that's a really interesting and one that isn't taught in many places, but it does speak to how different communities of white Christians had different thought processes. Because we've brought up a couple
Mm-hmm.
of different people, even just now. Like people, people who were plantation owners in Virginia had a very different idea of Christianity than the Quakers. And now you're talking about a group of evangelicals that had a very different conception of Christianity
Mm-hmm.
than either of those groups. It's bringing a lot of this is why our show is called Too Complicated, right? Like, because it brings there's a lot of nuance and sort of fractionalization of an era and a thought process and a perspective that is easy to brush over and sort of paint everyone with a single brush.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I think that I'm not surprised that there was a religious foundation for the thinking about their perspective on slavery. There's another strange incident, like strange events that really challenge the way you think about, like, oh, everyone just thought it was okay.
Mm-hmm.
Even during the war, the Revolutionary War, Congress had days of prayer, and the days of prayer were about the fact that they knew that this was a sin. And some of the prayers that were said on the floor of Congress was, despite the fact that we hold people in bondage, we hope that God will deliver us victory in this war. They were
Right.
praying to sort of counteract what they were acknowledging was immoral. This is just another example of where that perspective comes from,
Mm-hmm.
and why people thought that. But that's remarkable. I had no idea that evangelism stretched back this far.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. And you mentioned something too. Black people, Professor Minshew states that enslaved blacks were the first abolitionists because they actually struck and continued to strike the first blow against their enslavement. But the movement, anti-slavery and abolitionist, was an interracial movement.
Mm-hmm.
Hmm.
It was an interracial movement.
Right.
And there were whites who allied themselves with blacks and even native Indians to fight against this institution. One of the key people, you mentioned Virginia, in Oglethorpe's life when he was a young member of parliament, fighting to alleviate the plight of debtor prisoners and to evangelize Christians, was an evangelical named Thomas Bray. Dr. Thomas Bray founded three evangelical organizations. The third one was the Associates of Dr. Thomas Bray. The Bray schools were established throughout colonial America. There's one in Alexandria, Virginia. I think I
Right.
read that had been rehabilitated and reconstructed right there, a Bray school. And they were schools for enslaved black children primarily and their parents. By 1750, there was also a Bray school in Georgia where these schools, Anglican schools, even
Mm-hmm.
were being used to teach young children enslaved children, how to read and write. The Bray schools, they found one in Alexandria. I don't remember the details. I read it in the New York Times. They located it, still in existence today. But there was also one in Savannah, Georgia.
Mm-hmm.
And this would prove to be critical as I go forward in my narrative. When Sherman arrives in Atlanta, I'm skipping ahead
Right.
a whole century,
Yeah,
he
right.
meets with 20 black preachers.
Hmm.
Several of them were pastors of independent black churches that had existed throughout the slavery era.
Mm-hmm.
And out of this meeting, based on the advice from Reverend Frazier, Sherman issues Field Order Number 15 that establishes what became known as 40 Acres and a Mule, based on their advice. So the consequence, and there's a reason why it was against the law to learn how to read and write.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Henry Louis Gates even said about Diallo was that he affected the hardest escape from history ever recorded because he could write. I talk to young children when I go into school, particularly young kids of color and others. The ability to read and write is the most powerful asset you can have because that will free you if you master the tool sets needed to to hone those skills and to master those skills. So yes, it's nuanced, and I'm so happy you mentioned that. Oftentimes in American history, we painted this broad brush. Well, the Quakers in Pennsylvania, they opposed slavery, right? Isn't that
Mm-hmm.
basically it? And everyone else
Yeah.
supported it.
Yep.
Yeah.
That's the
Essentially.
broad brush.
Well, one of James Oglethorpe's most vocal supporters in his anti-slavery contingent in Georgia was another young evangelical that came to Georgia around 1734. He spoke eloquently against slavery. He tried to he wasn't an abolitionist. He was anti-slavery, but you
Mhm.
might know him. His name was John Wesley, the founder of the
Uh-huh.
Methodist Church.
Hmm. Huh.
That's a big name. Yep.
That's remarkable. Huh.
Yeah,
That's really
Oglethorpe
interesting.
recruited Wesley to come to Georgia to Christianize enslaved Native Americans and blacks and British colonists.
Now I feel like my entire sort of elementary and high school education on American history had like this crazy northern bias. I mean, obviously it's going to be biased towards Pennsylvania, but there were very little like as far as what the broad curriculum as far as contributions of people who were from the South. It's actually kind
Mm-hmm.
of given the list of people that you're now naming and how deep they were and how
Right.
how important they have been throughout history. That's fascinating. Now, American history takes a little bit of a darker turn towards the end of the 18th century as we go into the 19th century. So, how did his the abolition of slavery or the prohibition of slavery in Georgia and progress or change as time moved forward?
Well, the majority of the colonists in Georgia hated James Oglethorpe and John Wesley. John Wesley was run out of Georgia first. That was a smear campaign. They accused him of having an affair with a young woman here. It was basically concocted, I believe. So he was run out. James Oglethorpe won one of the most consequential battles in the early part of colonial America when he defeated the Spanish at the Battle of Bloody Marsh in 1743. But the pro-slavery forces continued to advocate and lobby against him in Parliament, in England, and with the trustees. So ultimately, he had to leave Georgia in July 1743 and go to England to face a trial for treason and 19 other charges. Treason, of course, is punishable by death if convicted. And he
Yeah.
faced financial ruin because he had invested large sums of money in the colony, but Parliament refused to reimburse him. And all of this was the result of an intense lobbying campaign to get him out of Georgia so that slavery could be legalized and so that the plantation, primarily rice, could be exported along the coast of Georgia. So Oglethorpe returns to England. He never comes back to Georgia. And that's usually where we leave Oglethorpe in Georgia history. But I follow Oglethorpe back to England. And so when he returns to England, ultimately he's vindicated of all charges. He's reimbursed. But then he becomes the patron saint of the first generation of British abolitionists. He mentors them.
Oh.
He mentors a man named Granville Sharp.
Yep.
He mentioned he mentors Oladu Equiano, who became the most influential black British subject in the early 18th century. If Martin Luther King was the most influential black man of the 20th century, Frederick Douglass, 19th century, Equiano, 18th century. And he befriends and mentors a young woman named Hannah More, white female. She's one of the first generation of feminist writers. These three people helped to found what becomes the formal abolitionist movement in 1787. And they were all mentees of James Oglethorpe.
It almost seems like this campaign against him almost continues. And that's why in the school system, he's still not acknowledged for what he did or, for his anti-slavery views and then what he did when he went to England. Because I would think at the founder of your state, you wouldn't just stop when they leave England, when they leave Georgia, you'd want to know his whole life. It's like everyone learns the whole life of George Washington. Why it almost feels like he still has something against that. Georgia still has something against him that they don't. Is it that they, the reason it's not known his views on slavery, or is there a reason that this James Oglethorpe is unknown? That's what I'm wondering.
Yeah, actually, I think you can answer this question with by answering something that I'm also curious about. Did you have any pushback to the book? Like, what was people's reaction to this? When you
Let me answer Lynn's question. Then
yeah.
bring me back, Isaac. Don't let me get away. I won't answer that question.
Yeah.
I'm not avoiding it. This was a 27-year journey for me, right?
Wow.
And so as I began to access more and more primary sources, when it became clear to me that the James Oglethorpe I knew was more or less manufactured, that his legacy had either been overlooked or marginalized or hidden, I realized that my life's calling now would be to tell this story. And let me tell you why. Now you ask why. Now Isaac. James Oglethorpe's story, you can't align it with the lost cause narrative.
Right.
If I ask you all, what's your historical view of Georgia? It has something to do with the Confederacy, right? It's Stone Mountain.
Yeah, the character even of the colony and then the early state of Georgia, because I like for us it's mostly Revolutionary era forward. So most of
Mhm.
what I know is Georgia's very pro-slavery, incredibly expansionist, pretty aggressive in both of those things.
It's the Deep South, which is
Yeah,
where,
more so than most of the other states. As far as the uh, none of the things that you've described about Oglethorpe,
right.
none of those.
You just can't
Uh,
align it. You look at the
yeah.
three guys on Stone Mountain. Robert E. Lee, Jefferson Davis, Stonewall Jackson. Neither one of
Mhm.
those are Georgians, by the way. But
No, they're not.
and you and you would think that Georgia was somehow created out of mist of the Confederacy in April 1861, right?
Yeah.
It
Right.
has this extremely rich history that predates it. And basically, the Confederacy is a contradiction of Oglethorpe's view in terms of Georgia also, uh, the oldest synagogue in the South is in Georgia. Oglethorpe welcomed Jewish colonists to
Huh.
Georgia. Third oldest in America, the oldest in the South, Mikvah Israel, is in Savannah, where you
Did not
had
know that.
that harsh anti-Semitism.
Mm-hmm.
He welcomed, well, he was forced into it to some extent. That was his Jewish doctor. The 42 Jewish colonists showed up. One of them was a doctor. There was an outbreak of malaria in the
Oh.
colony. The Jewish doctor said, I'm not coming off this boat unless you allow all of my co-religionists to settle here in the colony. Oglethorpe worked it out. And ultimately,
Everyone wins, yeah.
isn't that cool? He worked it out. And
Hmm.
this doctor, very famous, Dr. Nunez, a Jewish doctor. So it just doesn't fit. And so what
Right.
I want to do is to create at least a new chapter so
Hmm.
that one can see and embrace and celebrate and emulate this aspiring chapter in our history. I think it will benefit contemporary Georgians and future Georgians to help us recognize and appreciate the humanity of all humankind. See, James Oglethorpe was a humanist more than he was anything else. He saw humanity in Native India. He had one of the Yamacraw chiefs also visited England and met with the king and the queen. Diallo, the young man he rescued from Maryland, uh, ultimately met with the king and queen of England. He helped Sir Hans Sloane establish what will become the British Museum and
Oh, wow.
ultimately returned to Africa, a free man loaded with over 500 pounds of gold and silver because of James Oglethorpe. But more importantly, he introduced the British society to the fact that dark skinned people were intelligent and they were civilized, and these notions of the subhuman cannibalistic beast of burden, that began to erode that very racist narrative that
Hmm.
defined early 18th century England. But that was because of Oglethorpe. Oglethorpe wanted the rest of the British subjects to understand and experience what he knew about the humanity of other people. Hannah More, I mentioned the young lady. She was a brilliant playwright, and she published. She used her writing skills. She authored a poem called "Slavery," and it was authored to coincide with the first debate on chattel slavery in British Parliament. It became a national sensation.
Wow.
She became the target of misogyny and sexist attacks, obviously from men of that era. The one person who stood up to defend her and her intellect was James Oglethorpe. And she referred to James Oglethorpe, she always called him my beau. Now, Oglethorpe about 50 years older than she was, but he and she appreciated each other's intellect.
He's I can't tell if I think he feels more fictitious or
I
more
know,
real
right?
now based on all of this. But I think it. I'm happy. I'm actually happy that he is very much real and that you've done this research, because I think you're totally right in that um, if the only history that we have uh, They say if you're trying to redefine, some of what Georgian history was, that like without the lost cause, you have to put something else in its place.
Right.
You have to give them something to some values to say that these are ours. And here's a guy who has a ton of admirable values and who seems to have defined an era, but is not very well in a way that is not very well known.
Right.
Because those
there's
movements you
some
talked
bias,
about.
Isaac. You
Yeah.
mentioned something.
Yeah.
There's some
Yeah.
northern bias. Let me just, and I'm hopefully I'm not offending anyone, but if you were looking
Oh, it's fine.
for the first white man in North America to speak out against slavery, would you look for him in Georgia?
No.
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 No. No. There's no way.
Wouldn't even come across my mind.
I wouldn't even
Kind
have
of baffling.
Googled it. With their anti-slavery movement in Georgia.
Out of all the monuments and statues that exist that celebrates James Oglethorpe, not one of them mentioned his fight against slavery in the state of Georgia.
In the state in the state of Georgia. Huh.
Not one.
Well, I think we know your next big project is to push to get that added or to get a new statue, right?
Public history.
Yeah.
I think so. And I was reading, it was some narrative transcripts about the constitutional debates. There were constitutional delegates who stood up and spoke out against slavery, who argued that at the Constitution that there should be language to prohibit or outlaw the transatlantic slave trade.
Right.
Thomas Jefferson had language in the original Declaration of Independence.
That's right.
That spoke out against it. The opposition has always been there. We marginalized it for whatever reason and not embraced it. I think it's time for us to really, as we celebrate 250, hopefully we will celebrate the people who actually ended up on the right side of history.
Yes.
Yeah, I think I've thought a lot about that and like why we don't like to acknowledge the fact that people were speaking out at the time. And I think it makes it hard to think that they knew. Like guys like Washington knew. It makes it worse.
Yeah,
it makes it worse.
You know
like
how bad it is.
They
you know
understood
it's
the
immoral.
impact.
Yeah.
Yeah, and they understood the full dehumanization. Like they knew. They knew. It wasn't something that they didn't understand. It wasn't beyond their capabilities of intellect. They knew. And they chose to do it anyway. That's hard. That's really hard to accept.
It's hard to grapple with. Absolutely.
And they knew that there was going to be a day of reckoning.
Mm-hmm.
They knew that as well. They saw the cataclysmic net result of the Civil War. They knew that at one day that there would be bloodshed and death because of this embrace of the original sin. One of the things that's important that I tried to do is that these men, many of them who spoke out, some of them, were actually involved in the slave trade.
Mm-hmm.
And so what we've done, the entertainment of slavery actually dilutes or emanates your ability to speak out against it. But what I tried to point out was the distinction between anti-slavery and abolitionism.
Right.
The first generation were anti-slavery. The colonization movement, the Back to Africa movement, the American Colonization Society, which was founded by a man, Robert Finley, who became the president of the University of Georgia in 1817. The American Colonization Society, which was to relocate or emigrate free blacks from American soil, was an anti-slavery strategy. It wasn't an abolitionist society. They in many ways was trying to protect the institution of slavery. But you have to follow the arc of the evolution of this fight. The first iteration of it was to prove or argue or support the notion that black people were human beings. We were not subhuman.
Right.
Before we fought the fight to end slavery, because you think about it, a horse is basically maintained capture, aren't they?
Right.
Yeah. They're harnessed with it. So a subhuman, it's okay, it's legitimized. Right. So this fight took many iterations of it. And we have to embrace all of these avenues that resulted in ultimately the demise of it. Oglethorpe, basically, his contributions have more or less been lost. I'll say it again. In British colonial America, we know William Penn, you from Pennsylvania, right?
Yeah. I
Yep.
know William Penn. Yeah.
Roger
Absolutely.
Smith, I guess Virginia. We know these people. You know nothing about Oglethorpe.
Well, hopefully
No,
your book will start to change that.
No, it's this podcast. That's what's going to
Oh, that's
change it.
right.
Yeah,
That's
the
right.
Yeah.
book.
I forgot.
But
You
yeah,
know how
Lynn, you said
powerful we are.
Oh no. I smile, I laugh, but it is so true because you all focus on history that's overlooked, that's nuanced, that's not a part of the prevailing narrative. If you look at the history of abolition in America, one name that's rarely mentioned is James Oglethorpe
That's true.
yeah,
and Georgia.
for sure.
Have
Yeah,
you?
we had. Yeah, go ahead, Lynn. Sorry.
Oh, I was just gonna ask if you've had any negative feedback from anyone about this change in trying to expand this knowledge of Oglethorpe, or if anyone's pushing back, because I know when you try to add to narratives, change narratives, people get upset.
Absolutely. I expected it from either one or two areas. Obviously, there are people who may not want this expanded view of
Mm-hmm.
Oglethorpe.
Right.
Honestly, I expect that there will be some people say, why is this black guy trying to revise the reputation of this long dead white guy,
Mm-hmm.
Sure.
right, who was deputy governor of a slave trading firm, right? I mean, surprisingly, and I've traveled not just in metro Atlanta, across the state of Georgia, people embrace it.
That's
It's
hopeful.
inspiring, it's inclusive.
Right.
And Oglethorpe was by no means a perfect person. And that's one of the things, the fact that he began the journey. I don't try to, when I was working on the manuscript, I tried not to hide the fact of where the journey began. I
Mm-hmm.
think it
Right.
gives him more credibility. See, we live in a world
Right.
now, particularly in politics, where the last thing you will ever do is admit you were wrong.
That is
Right.
so true.
You don't admit you're wrong. Matter of fact, if confronted, rather than admit it, what do? You double down
Yep.
on your wrongness. Oglethorpe was a person who had the ability to see and then to process in an objective way, to rationalize, to see that this is a human being. These are human beings that we are enslaving. And then to follow this arc
Yeah.
that set in motion a movement that ended not just Anglo, but ultimately American chattel slavery as well.
Being able to see your mistake, to acknowledge it, and to change is something that's very, very rare in politicians today, and just in people today. I mean, that takes courage, and I think that's something that we should um, advocate, not just for politicians, but just in general. That it's more courageous to admit a mistake than it is to cover it up.
Yeah, and I think this might be a little this might be a little preachy, um, but and maybe it's just because it's an election year that I'm that I'm feeling this way. But I think when you're the embrace that you're talking about, I think people are desperate for a history that makes them feel inspired, for
Yeah.
parts of American history that they can hold on to and feel proud of. I think people want that. And what you described in Oglethorpe and the ability to change, we started out this whole podcast journey. Our first episode was the birth of the American identity.
Mm-hmm.
And this was years ago that we did that interview with a historian named Lindsay Travinsky. And she said she didn't have a good idea. There was no good answer at the time
Of what it meant to be an American.
of what it meant to be
Yeah.
an American. And I think one of the things that I keep coming across when we talk about the history that we do want to latch onto, and figures like Oglethorpe, and something that feels truly American, is the belief that we can get better,
Mm-hmm.
the belief that there is a better horizon in front of us, and that it might be challenging to get there, but that's possible.
Right.
When you're talking about people coming over here to found a new debtors, anyone coming into to a colony to find a new life, the ability to think that we could theoretically change the status quo and, get rid of an institution that was so integral, like chattel slavery. That the abolitionists wouldn't believe that feels American to me.
Mhm.
And Oglethorpe feels very American to me, based on what you've described. I mean, there's nothing more American than than trying to be better than you have been. I think he's a remarkable guy and deserves to be spoken about, amongst the rest of the founding fathers.
Wow, that's beautiful,
Absolutely.
Isaac. Thank you. I mean, you've said it. I mean, it's so eloquent what you said, and I appreciate it so much. And it does. He is America. And the thing we have to resist is that to cancel, nobody's perfect. So
Right.
it's not that when Georgia was founded, slavery, serfdom, forced labor, one historian said freedom was the peculiar institution, not slavery.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so here in America, in a wilderness where death lurked around every corner, this man and a few other small contingent said no. It is such a powerful statement in terms of what it means to be human, to 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 embrace the idea. And I appreciate you saying that. I think he should be listed among the great founding fathers of British colonial America. He's not.
Yeah.
He can't be considered an American
yeah.
founding father because he didn't sign the Constitution, didn't sign the Declaration.
Right.
But he is a founding father.
Yeah.
Of colonial British America.
Right.
And he should be celebrated. And one of the things, particularly you mentioned politics, and we often, we're a sitcom society. It's 30 minutes. It got to be worked out, right? Whatever the problem is, 3 commercial sets, it's all over. We have to understand that history casts the final ballot. And so part of the narrative in Georgia is that, they tried to prohibit slavery, but they failed. It didn't work because without slavery, Georgia, North America, couldn't prosper. You heard all that, right? We needed to do it. It was practical.
Oh, yeah.
Oglethorpe did not fail. I live in a slave-free Georgia. I live in a slave-free Georgia. The Georgia that he envisioned is the Georgia that exists today. And we have to oftentimes look at that arc, Dr. King called it, the moral arc of the universe. It's always been towards justice. Yeah. It has been towards justice in this regard. And we celebrate him. Now, he paid a political price for believing what he believed. And that we all need to understand that oftentimes when you had the courage to stand up against sexism or racism, all type of misogyny and gender bias or sexual orientation bias, you have to have the courage to stand up. Now, you won't always be celebrated for it, but you have to let history cast the final ballot.
That's right.
And my book, I hope, represents history casting the ballot for James Oglethorpe. Not a perfect man, many deficits, but somebody who was courageous enough to speak out against one of the most horrific institutions ever created on the face of the planet.
Well, I appreciate that you're bringing him back into focus, and you're finally trying to help his reputation, not only in Georgia but in all of the U.S. And so hopefully he will become more well known, and he won't be, that reputation he got in life will no longer be an issue now that history is judging. So let's, you're doing him right. So I think we're happy about that.
Thank you. I've really enjoyed this conversation, and thank you all for having me. It's just a pleasure, and it's interesting. It's interesting. Thank you all for being interested in the founding father of the state of Georgia.
It's more than interesting. It's inspiring.
Yeah. This has been fascinating. Is there anything, do you have a website, or is there anywhere online that you would want if people want to learn more about you? Where could they go to find you online?
MichaelThurmond.net.
Perfect.
Is my website where you can find out more about the book and upcoming engagements. I'm excited. I think we talk about it in terms of Georgia, but you have to think now, this is American history.
Oh, yeah,
Hmm.
This is American
absolutely.
history. This is a part of how we became who we are. Some of
Hmm.
his ideas are ideas that were incorporated, I believe, in the Declaration of Independence, in the Constitution, that became who we are and what it means to be an American, to invite people of different religious backgrounds being persecuted. One of the big issues I mentioned, unemployment and debt of prisoners. So Oglethorpe passes a bill in 1729 that freed 10,000 British debtors from prison.
Oh, wow.
That he became a national hero. That's how he
Oh, I
became a
bet.
national hero. However,
Yeah.
in politics, y'all, if you solve one problem, you create another problem, right?
Yep.
So if you release 10,000 debtors from prison, where do you think they went to live? They became homeless on the streets of London.
Right.
He's like, I
Part
guess
of
I have
what
to
he
find a
was
place for
trying
them to
to
go.
do
Yeah.
was create a solution for homelessness.
Hmm.
But rather than writing off or marginalizing homeless people, he thought that he could create an opportunity for them not only to be supported to themselves, but also to be supported to the British Empire.
Right.
He didn't see them as refuse, as helplessness, as
Right.
of no value. And he talks about creating value for Great Britain
Hmm.
in the homeless population,
Hmm.
an
Gosh.
issue we
Yeah.
struggle with to this day.
Today, absolutely.
Yeah. There's a lot to. There's a lot of in his thinking that we could, he's a historical figure worth looking back on
Yes.
and seeing, and learning about.
Relevant.
Uh,
Yes.
Very, very happy that we were able to have this conversation today, and we'll put your website in the show notes so
Yes.
people can go buy a copy of the book and,
Oh,
and,
please.
and give it a
Amen.
read. But also, hopefully, if you live within a reasonable distance from anywhere that you might be speaking, hopefully they'll be able to come to one of your engagements.
Yeah,
Thank you.
absolutely.
And
Yeah,
you can purchase Amazon, all the other, brick and mortar, and all the other places you go on the internet to purchase.
Absolutely.
yeah,
Well, thank you so
and
much for taking the time today to speak with us. And this has just been wonderful.
No, it's been an honor, really. I was so delighted when I received the email. I mean, it was just great. Thank you.
Oh, thank you.
thank you. Oh, and thank you to our supporters over on Patreon who support all of these conversations. So if you want to hear more talks about really interesting historical figures that have fallen through the cracks of your curriculum, make sure to go to patreon.com/primary source media. You can get behind the scenes access to a bunch of our shows, early access to some of our content, and we even do some book giveaways of some signed copies of from some of the historians and writers that we talked to. So be sure to check that out. And also make sure to follow us on social media and check out our YouTube at youtube.com / at primary source media to see video versions of the podcast.